Hello, welcome to today's virtual community conversation titled Building a Dream Team, the Importance and Impact of Social Capital. I'm Elizabeth Trotman, Senior Vice President of Civic Leadership Programs and Initiatives for Foundation for the Carolinas. Today's virtual event is a part of an ongoing educational series presented by the Robinson Center for Civic Leadership, the flagship program of Foundation for the Carolinas. The Robinson Center, named for Sally and Russell Robinson, convenes partners and funding to address our region's greatest needs and opportunities. In alignment with this vision, this virtual conversation series focuses on highlighting a variety of important community issues and ways to get involved. Today, we are pleased to have a panel of distinguished national and local leaders who will share their insight and research. And now I would like to introduce our moderator, Foundation for the Carolinas Executive Vice President of Civic Leadership, Brian Collier.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and certainly thanking all of the panelists who have taken time out to talk to us today. This is a topic, those of you who know me know that this is something very near and dear to my heart. As we were working on the Opportunity Task Force and the report that came out after it, we kept hearing certain phrases and hearing stories from people around our community that led us to believe that in addition to all the programmatic things that we might recommend around early childhood, college and career, affordable housing, family stability, all of these other things, we kept hearing two things that really resonated to us as what we determined to be cross-cutting factors. One was the negative implications of being segregated and living in a segregated community. And the other was the stories that we heard of networks and relationships that changed the trajectory of our children's lives and of adults' lives. One that we came to term in the report is social capital. We're going to talk about that today. We're going to talk about maybe what it means, some solutions, what people in our community are doing. But in the report, what we cited a quote from Hillbilly Elegy, where he says that social capital is a professor's term, but the concept is simple. The networks of people and institutions around us have real economic value. They connect us to the right people and ensure that we have opportunities and impart valuable information. Without them, we're going it alone. And so what we did in the report was to identify this as one of our key factors, and as I said, cross-cutting determinants. But it's always difficult to take this kind of thing and move it into action, because a lot of people want to say, well, I can't figure out how to measure it. How do you measure cause and effect? What are the policies and programs that might move it along? Yet I think everyone on this call today would agree that it is how you move in our society. It is what made each of us who we are today and how we got to where we are. So that's why I'm anxious to have this conversation with the panel today. And I'm hopeful that those of you in the audience will also ask questions. We have a short period of time. It's a huge topic in a short period of time, but I hope you'll ask some questions that we can answer either today or in follow-up. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our panel. First, I want to introduce Bob McKinnon. Bob and I have known each other for a long time, and he's Executive Director of Moving Up Media Lab and Adjunct Professor at the Powell School of Civic and Global Leadership. Welcome, Bob. Next, I want to bring on Dr. Michelle Meggs. Dr. Meggs is Executive Director of UNC Charlotte's Women and Girls Research Alliance. Welcome, Dr. Meggs. Next is my good friend, Richard Reeves. Richard is, as many of you know, with Brookings Institution. He is the John C. and Nancy D. Whitehead Chair and Senior Fellow of Economic Studies and the Director of the Future of the Middle Class Initiative at the Brookings Institution. Welcome, Richard. And then finally, I want to bring on Harold Rice. Harold is the Chief Executive Officer of the Ada Jenkins Center and founder and director of the Black Social Capital Initiative. Welcome, Harold. So let's jump right into it. Richard, I'll throw the first question in your direction. As I said, a lot of people have varying definitions of social capital and the way that they think about it. For the purposes of today's discussion in regards to economic opportunity, how do you think about social capital at the community and the individual level? And then why is it important that we talk about it?
Thank you, Brian. And thanks to you, the foundation, and to Elizabeth for allowing me to join this panel. I mean, you're right. Social capital is one of those terms that has almost as many definitions as it does people writing and talking about it. And so I think you have to be honest about that from the outset. And that's not a problem as long as we know what we're talking about in the context of economic mobility. Every definition tends to say something like networks, social networks. And so I think the key distinction to make is between the idea of relationships and the idea of material resources. Social capital is intrinsically relational. Right? It's about personal relationships. And so you can think about the resources that go into schools or into people's pockets or transportation and so on. Those might facilitate relationships, but they're not relational. So it's a hugely important kind of relational asset. And I think, therefore, it's intrinsically local, it's intrinsically community-based. Now, it's not as if you can't conduct relationships like remotely, and we've all learned that over the last few years, but the kinds of relationships we're talking about are the ones which allow people to access information, knowledge, power in a way that can change the trajectory of their life. And I think that what that's really about is helping people to navigate institutions. I see the key role of social capital as being a kind of navigational one, and particularly around key transitions in people's lives. And so the question is like, what are you getting out of that relationship? Now that sounds like a very selfish way to think about it, but it's what is the relationship bringing to you? And it can be bringing support through difficult times. But in the context of economic mobility, we also want to be bringing something else, something you wouldn't be getting through other sources, such as through an institution and so on too. And so I think that's why it's hugely important that it's at a local level. But the last thing I'll say about this, I think it's just in terms of doing some distinguishing at the beginning. Social capital is not a feeling or an attitude. And I sometimes think that gets confused. I think even Brian, you've pointed to research that was done in Charlotte before, that if you include things like philanthropic giving or certain attitudes, Charlotte scores quite well in terms of social capital. But that's not social capital. A warm feeling or a fat check does not constitute social capital because it's not relational. There's no relationship at stake there. So even if I like you, I feel good about you and have all the right attitudes, and maybe I write the right checks to the right institutions, that's not social capital. Social capital is face-to-face, eye-to-eye, relational. It's built on human and personal relationships. And so I think that's an important distinction to make too. And we'll get into this, I hope, but the real challenge, I think, is how at a community level we facilitate the conditions within which social capital can grow. And therefore kind of promote economic mobility. So as you said, Brian, it's a big topic, so I better stop there.
No, well, I guess just to quickly follow up on that, because I think most people would think of social capital in a purely good way. It's better that you have a stronger network, but there are dark sides to social capital, aren't there? There are negative aspects to it.
Right, so I think that's the important distinction between the relationship and the network and the purpose and impact of the network. So you're back to Bob Putnam and his original stuff. He had a whole chapter on the mafia and organized crime and the very rich social capital networks you see in organized crime. Maybe in a more salient way, imagine you've got a very affluent white neighborhood that has incredibly rich networks within it. And those networks are mostly used to support policies of segregation. So that's rich social capital being used for the wrong end, if you like. And so I think it's a useful distinction, Brian, which is to think there's nothing intrinsically good about thick relationships unless those relationships are used in a way that reduces inequality rather than adds to it. And that brings you on to the idea of bridging versus bonding social capital. There's bonding social capital is just people who are, and we'll get onto this, I hope, where I have great relationships with people who are like me, right? Mm-hmm. But if the goal is to disrupt patterns of inequality and structural inequality in particular, great relationships with people like me is not what we need. What we need is bridging social capital, which is to build relationships across neighborhoods, across social classes, across racial groups very often, in order to kind of break down the structural inequalities that lie. Now, it's not an instead of resource reallocation, it's an as well as resource reallocation. But I've come to believe very strongly that without that kind of relational connection, it's much harder to motivate people to make the other difficult decisions we need to make to promote a more equitable community.
Which leads me to a question to Harold. You have been instrumental in helping create a relatively new initiative called the Black Social Capital Initiative. And you have an emphasis on expanding the depth and number of Black leaders in our community, especially those in the nonprofit sector. First of all, tell us a little bit about the initiative, and then what are the key challenges that you see within your initiative and how we can help with those efforts?
Sure. And again, thank you for being here, Brian and Elizabeth and the foundation. Back in 2017, I was at a workshop that talked about succession planning and how Charlotte lacked minority leadership in the nonprofit space at the executive level. There were three things that kind of came up anecdotally. One was Black leaders lack interest. The other is lack the skills and talent, and then lack the social capital. And then as I share with you, they looked at me and said, well, what do you think? And then
that wasn't exactly how you phrased it, or at least maybe when you sent out the warning call.
Right. And then at that point, I realized that, I was upset about that because I knew that there were people of color, Black individuals that I knew that were striving to be at the top, but perhaps just was unaware of the pipeline or the process. And so I reached out to my social capital because, again, this is a new term, fairly new term, to say, hey, I know that there are jobs that come open at the top level. How are people learning about these opportunities? And they said, obviously, they're happening before the ad goes out, right? And so, it was incumbent upon me to say, hey, well, I want to be able to create a pipeline where next level leaders, Black leaders, can, one, learn how to understand that what leadership will look like for them as a Black leader, as a person of color, because it looks different. But also, two, be paired up with the current CEO who looks like them as they're going through some workshops. So, the goal, again, is to make sure that there is a viable pipeline. So you talked about challenges. One challenge is search firms being able to have a list, if you will, of viable candidates. And so being in front of the search firms, making sure that they connect with individuals when there's not a vacancy, just to build some relationship, just to build social capital, is going to be really, really important. It was key to my success. As I just met with people for coffee and conversation, they got to know Harold. And then when something came available, they already knew me. It wasn't, I'm trying to scramble to get in front of these people. The other challenge is being on boards. Black individuals or people of color having more of an opportunity to serve on boards, especially where the people that the organization is serving are primarily people of color. I think, organizations, foundations, grant makers are asking these questions now, which they should. Does your board represent the people that you serve? And so I think boards have to be intentional about having people of color or Black individuals at that table, because, again, that's where the decisions are being made. And I think it's really, really important for that to continue to happen. And also, lastly, who's really doing the hiring? Again, the search firm will bring the candidates to you, but the board is making the decision. So it's important for, again, pipeline candidates to get in front of board chairs, co-chairs, the committee chairs, often as they can for coffee and conversation, so people will know who they are and know what their work is as well. Legacy projects, these things that happen, unfortunately, in our community, where you can raise your profile, if you will, but also be in front of decision makers.
Well, it reminds me when we were out there talking, especially to the kids, they thought they were doing, everything right by certain things, but maybe applying for a job online, but they didn't. And I think we even put in the report that they were acknowledged that the playing field was uneven, but what they didn't understand was that there are multiple playing fields that perhaps they're not even on. Like you said, jobs are being interviewed for and recruited for in a separate pathway than people just applying online. And it's really important and incumbent. I think Richard's written some material that I've always kind of referred back to on these aspirational goals, and this idea that you need to know that the opportunity exists. You need to believe in you need to have the sense of confidence in those around you to connect you to them and make you believe that you can achieve those. So I'm huge admirer of the work that you're doing, and we'll come back to that in just a few moments. So Bob, I want to turn to you because you kind of, I think it's fair to say, sort of taken a look at your life and tried to map how you got to where you are and who were the people who were influential in sort of at various points in your life. And you've come to term that as your American Dream Team. Want to talk a little bit about that and tell everyone sort of what it is, how you came to think about it in this way, and why it's important?
I win the award for the first person to forget to take himself off mute. I took one for the
18
team
months
there.
into it.
I took one for the team there. So yeah, so thank you, Brian. Thanks to the foundation. It's great to be with everyone here today. The idea behind your dream team was, as you mentioned, Brian, it was the result of an ongoing reflection that I was trying to figure out for myself. I grew up in poverty outside of Boston and then in rural PA. My life outcome was dramatically different from other people I grew up with or even family members. And so there was this ongoing understanding of trying to figure out like, well, what contributes to it? And so through the work of our organization, we're obviously looking at all the factors that we know sort of contribute to social mobility. But I was also looking for ways to sort of bring that home in a more personal way. And so several years ago, I was asked to give a TEDx talk, and I did it. And as part of the exercise, I just wondered if I sat down and wrote down all the names of people that if it weren't for them, I wouldn't be on the stage. And the list grew and grew and grew. And the joke I made was that it was like the worst PowerPoint slide ever, because you're only supposed to have like 6 or 10 words on it, and this had literally hundreds. And it was just very revealing in terms of just people I'd forgotten about or overlooked, or it was this thing that you kept sort of adding to and digging. Oh, I forgot that person introduced me to so-and-so, or I got the scholarship because of this. And it just brought a tremendous amount of gratitude and appreciation, and also a desire to realize, I think the beauty of a dream team is not only do you feel more grateful yourself, but it also serves as an impetus to try to be on more and more dream teams of others. So if you remember, for example, that you had a mentor that was important for you, or you had someone to introduce you to this, it's hard then to say no. And sadly, what we know from research and part of the work that we do at the Moving Up Media Lab is trying to also understand the psychological underpinnings about how we think about mobility. And we generally, in this country, have a narrative of hard work is what is the primary driver, sort of the bootstraps sort of mentality. And of course, we want everyone to work hard, but it also means that we often forget or diminish the other factors that we know contribute to success. And just as an example of that, when we did a national survey years ago amongst Americans and asked them to rank the factors they thought contributed to success or were essential for achieving your dreams, hard work was named by 90+% of Americans, but knowing other successful people was right at the bottom, just barely above luck. An articulation of what some would refer to as fundamental attribution error, this idea that like we attribute our success primarily to ourselves and diminish the role that others or environmental factors or systems play in where we end up in life. And so the dream team, which started off as just an idea and a PowerPoint slide, through the generosity of the foundation, we were able to create something that now allows others to create their own dream team digitally and share it. And one of the things that's remarkable about that is when you look to see what people create, you can see the disparities. You see people who have names with, or dream teams with hundreds, and then people have 4. And you can automatically sort of see that the person with 4 names is going to have a harder road than others. And so part of this is really trying to take what can be a heady concept like social capital and break it down into something really personal, like who helped me and how can I help others?
So Bob, real quickly, I know that you've recently put out a book that's sort of a revision of The Little Train That Could, or Little Engine That Could.
Yep.
Speak briefly about how you're trying to take this concept and even sort of teach young children that, you know, that the paths of everyone's path is not the same, and some do have additional hurdles.
Yeah, I grew up, I'm sure others have, reading The Little Engine That Could. It sort of asked us all to believe in ourselves and to work hard to get over life's mountains. And that's really important lesson. Three Little Engines is a slightly different tale that asks us to also believe in each other and to help each other get off the mountains if someone is struggling, to not only be aware of your journey, but to look around and be aware of the journey of others. And in some ways, the book itself is actually a really wonderful example of the importance of social capital, because, you know, that book would not have made possible if it weren't the fact that I was introduced to research that was being done by someone of the name Shai Davide at Columbia, who was doing this work about headwinds and tailwinds. And he forwarded to me an article that was written about his work from Maria Konnikova in the New Yorker called America's Surprising Views on Inequality. The end of that article, Shai was asked what he does in his own life to reflect his research. And he says, well, I don't read The Little Engine That Could to my kids. I've always hated that book because some engines can't, and it's not fair. And I thought that was a little harsh, but it was the inspiration then for, well, I wonder if there's a different way to tell this story, to try to correct the narrative that it's just about, you know, you working hard to get over a mountain, but also recognizing that sometimes we get stuck and we need help, and to look around and to see the journeys of others. And I can also just tell you that I could go on for this for a long time, but I won't. Everything that is possible with that book, including the media coverage it's gotten, it made the New York Times bestseller list, all of that is because of personal connections, you know. And you know, you look at a book and you see a couple names on the title, but I encourage everyone to spend time reading the acknowledgements, or also just wondering like what else had to take place for something to be successful.
You know, it's I think that's one of the hardest things to get a social capital initiative moving, is because there's this lack of acknowledgement among some that it is important. It is the way that they got to where they are. And just a quick little anecdote that I used to work for Paul Newman, and the actor, and it was an amazing thing for me, because he always led in every conversation with the role of luck in his life and in his career. And to have someone with that stature acknowledging that, you know, chance 50-50 could have gone, or you know, less than could have gone any direction for him. So I think for those of us listening in the audience, especially those of us who do have the dream team behind us, we need to first acknowledge that and you know, do what we can to pass it on. Yeah. So Dr. Meggs, you have a very special you know, the things that you're doing with the Women and Girls Alliance. Really curious, one, about the particular needs of women and girls when it comes to social capital. And then I know the COVID crisis has exacerbated some of those issues. Could you talk a little bit about it from that perspective?
Absolutely, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm really happy to be a part of this conversation. I think that one of the things that we have learned about the COVID crisis is that it has absolutely exacerbated and unveiled some of the complicating issues that are happening in our society. As a result of COVID, it has revealed that our social network and our social safety network, I should say, is extremely damaged. And that people who have not had to access that network prior to COVID-19 have found that it is woefully underfunded, and that we need help to rebuild a social safety network. And I think that the assumptions around those who need access to it and who need access to the assistance that is available has shifted. And the assumptions around who needs help and why they need help, has transformed and is transforming. I think that COVID-19 has revealed the need for affordable childcare that is safe for mothers who are working and for children. I think it has revealed that minimum wage is not enough for people to live on, particularly for working moms. I think what COVID has revealed is the numbers of women who have left the workforce because they have to take on additional duties as caregivers. I think that the role that social capital plays for women in the midst of COVID-19 is how women are able to take care of one another in ways that is not seen in traditional networking. The ways that these happen in these cultural enclaves that is not privy to outsiders, and the way that social capital happens in ways that communities do that helps that acknowledges their humanity and sense of self, where we're dealing in a culture where we're dealing with racialized and gendered norms that kind of takes away from the humanity of women and girls for various reasons. And I think that COVID-19 has shown us the ways in which the larger culture does not always honor the humanity and the personhood of women and girls.
When you and I were speaking yesterday or the other day, I think, again, what I heard from you was oftentimes we think about social capital, and even we put it in the report in terms of what does the network have to offer someone from another community? In other words, I should extend my social capital so that a young child somewhere else or an individual somewhere else has access to my network. But if I understood what you were also trying to tell me is sometimes I've got to acknowledge that I need to understand someone else's network, that I need to understand someone else's, the culture in which they feel comfortable in, and perhaps extend myself, not just bring someone into my network and educate them on what it means to, work at a nonprofit or be in the white world, or it's about me being humble enough to come and learn about others in our community.
Absolutely. I am a firm believer that wisdom comes from all corners, right? That there's something that everyone we encounter can teach us, and that the ways in which people present themselves, that we should not automatically assume that there isn't anything that we can learn from them. And there is social capital and learning happening all over the place. But because people approach it with a particular mindset, they completely miss the lessons that are happening in communities all around us. And there is an assumption that people aren't learning how to encounter the world, that people aren't learning how to construct alternative narratives of wholeness and well-being, and how to see themselves, and how to confront these structures, and how to deconstruct barriers, and how to address institutions. When that is in fact happening, it just looks different. And I think that there are ways that these communities can teach us how to think differently, and how to approach differently, and how to understand how life happens in other spaces. And I think it would help us when we go back to our communities to say, I've learned how to view this differently. And if we look at it from a different perspective, I think it opens our minds up to understand how the world works in different communities and different circles. And I think that also, if we learn to understand how life works for people, if we learn to look at it from the perspective of women and what that looks like, what does it look like from the perspective of a young girl? If we're going out into a corporation, what does it mean to understand how women choose to build social capital? How does that happen in a more conversational? How do we begin to deconstruct this idea of meritocracy when we're very clear that that does not work? How do we begin to reconstruct what it means for us to work on a more communal level instead of hoarding resources for ourselves because we're afraid that there isn't enough? Social capital works from this understanding that there is enough in this system for everyone. There's enough to go around for everybody, and there's no need to hoard that. And that's with information, with resources and everything.
Well, and I think, when Richard and I were talking a little bit earlier, and the first question was, there's a dark side to social capital, which is the hoarding, the tribalism, the sense that we have to pull in, we have to pull in and protect, we have to protect our own and protect our own resources. And right before the COVID crisis, Richard and I were kind of thinking through what a larger community initiative might look like. And you just hit on a topic that, or a wording that I think was relevant, which was this idea of Charlotte. There is abundant resources in this community. We have enough to go around.
Mhm.
You know, there is a false sense of scarcity that our tribes have sort of, you know, told us is true. So we need to break out of that. So I appreciate you bringing that into the room. Richard, last October, the Brookings Institution put out some research in large part with UNC Charlotte and with local researchers around social capital. And I think it was relatively groundbreaking in terms of the national discussion around social capital. It's called How We Rise. Do you have some findings, some initial findings you'd like to share with the community? I know we did a session for some around it, but what were some of the things that really stuck out to you? And especially given what Harold said earlier about networks for Black executives, and we've just reflected on girls and women. So what were things that stuck out to you in that report?
Thanks, Brian. Well, actually, it's a perfect segue from what Dr. Meggs was just saying, I think, about some of the differences in the construction of social capital. So I should say, first of all, the work was led by my colleague, Camille Bousset, who runs the Race, Prosperity and Inclusion Initiative, although I was a co-author with it. And I think what was different about it, we worked with a lot of people in Charlotte, as you know, four different cities, Charlotte, Racine, San Francisco, and DC, 430 interviews, which generated about 30,000 networks. And then we mapped those networks. And actually, I'll put a link to a summary of the research in the chat, so everyone can kind of get to it. And the main findings you'll see in that summary document were, we saw in all the cities for a pretty strong segregation by race of social networks. It varied a little bit between place, but it's going to be one example. In DC, of the white men in DC, 97% of their social networks were white. So you see very kind of strong, you know, homogeneity, sameness in some of these social networks, rather than this kind of bridging, certainly across racial lines. Another big finding, and Camille's done a lot more work on this too, and I'm doing more work in this space, is that we found everywhere that Black men had the smallest dream team, to use Bob's phrase, which I love, in terms of getting access to the sorts of networks which would help them with jobs, education, and housing. And those are the three things we really looked at. So we're looking at relationships. We're looking at how can these relationships help you in these quite concrete areas. Including, I mean, the work that Harold's just been talking about around jobs. And in Charlotte, it was actually, I think we saw the smallest number of all. So in Charlotte, Black men said they typically had one person that they could turn to for support. And then next, actually, thinnest networks were in the Latino population in those groups. And I think for some of the reasons that Dr. Meggs was just mentioning, actually, Black women actually kind of developed these quite interesting horizontal thick social networks for support, I think exactly along the lines that she's just mentioned. Big difference between Black women and Black men. And obviously we can think about, you know, it's not necessarily a surprise why that should be the case. One of our other findings is, where do people make these networks, right? So this is back to Bob's point, like where are they made? And they don't come out of thin air. Those relationships have to be formed somewhere, in communities, in families, but we found that a lot of them are formed in educational institutions, or in places of work. And then you think about the institutions that Black men are very often excluded from. And so the exclusion from an institution has this second round effect, which is to exclude you from the sources of developing relationships, which may help you to do better in the future and lower the risk of exclusion. And so there's this really vicious circle. And in particular, the issue of kind of Black boys in education and Black men in education, and then and then incarceration and employment. So it's a well-known story, but we really, really focused on the social capital effects of that. That's where they found. And then, perhaps not surprisingly, we found a big class gap as well. And the class gap, interestingly, wasn't necessarily in the quantity of relationships. It was in the quotes quality of relationships. And you know why I'm putting it in quotes, because what that means is that relationships that were able to deliver to you resources and information and access that you would not otherwise have got. So this is not the kind of relationship that's just going to help you out when you need help. It's more about lifting you up. It's going to give you something else. And what we found was that higher income people were more likely to have networks that could provide something, bring something to the table above and beyond that crucial support. which was more mobility enhancing. So as Harold just knowing about the job in advance, helping you figure out the FAFSA, knowing how to kind of secure your credits to transfer from one college to another, or whatever it is, that's above and beyond just being there for you. It's being there for you in a way that's kind of proactively pro-economic mobility. And there are pretty big class gaps there. And so the result of that was to think about what it means for policy, which is in the rest of the report. But those are the kind of key stark findings. And I'll come back again to this need to think intersectionally, and the need to look about class and race and gender. And when you do that, you do see this peculiarly disadvantaged position for Black men in the social capital landscape. And I think that really needs to be the focus of singular efforts.
Well, and it reinforced for me the whole the systems approach to this, that if we know that relationships are made, let's just take your example, if we know that relationships are cemented and expanded in educational institutions, then we need to ensure that the pipeline is expanded for those who need access to those networks the most. So it was a great, I know it was a challenge because a lot of that research was done in the face of COVID. You had to shift the methodology, the process during the middle of it, but I found it to be really valuable and a great addition to the body of research that we can use to inform our work. Harold, speaking of the report and of the findings and the things that Richard just pointed out, you're working with Black leaders. Can you talk a little bit maybe about what steps the Black Social Capital Initiative has taken to help with new leaders and building their social networks?
Yeah, and ditto to everything Richard was saying. I was just shaking my head the entire time. You know, we've dedicated an entire workshop to social network, social capital, and civic involvement. You know, we're asking the question, you know, where have you been invited? Have you been invited to Rotary clubs? Have you been invited to Kiwanis? You know, in putting ourselves, and me in particular, as a Black person, into an environment that is really new to me, was key for my success, right? Here I am in the north part of Mecklenburg County. I'm in a Rotary club that I'm probably the only Black person there, but someone invited me, right? And so it starts to beg the question, what other rooms can I be invited to that I can bring others towards, and also, right, leverage my social capital? I just think it's important that we understand that we need allies to help us. It's all of us that brings in a good social capital network. And so we challenge the cohort to look at their own social network and where have they been invited, or where would they like to be? How could they leverage each other or the relationship to expand their career? And lastly, like, how would you look back and help others in the same vein, right? I think that's important. The greatest gift you can give to anyone is the gift of yourself. All of the mentors, all of the current CEOs, we have access to them. And before then, we didn't have access to all the Black CEOs, right? And so we can get all of them into a room. And now we can leverage that. And it's just not Black people. Again, Black social capital is not just Black folk. It's about, right, understanding that you're Black, but how can you leverage social capital as a whole? And so, again, some of these other groups, such as a lot of different Rotary or Kiwanis or any other, the boat clubs, if you will help leverage social capital and social networks. And so we're just really making sure that people are aware of those things and what the real and true purpose of it. It could even also be church, right? Your faith. You know, we've had the conversation about, as Black leaders, you know, do you attend your homegrown Black church? Or do you go somewhere where you're not spiritually led to another church only to gain social capital? Those are conversations we have to have, right? Me, myself, I'm not going anywhere where I'm not spiritually led. That's me. But there are others that have these conversations. So we just have to put that out there for further conversation. You know, I just think it's really, really important, again, that I want to put out there that we need allies to invite us to certain things as well that happens.
Yeah, like Karen put in there, that is the key, being invited. And it's about intentionality of those who are putting the room together or who are making the invite list. It's about that intentionality. Dr. Meigs, we've talked a little bit about Black nonprofit leaders, a little bit about Black men and boys. With regard to women and girls, especially with the role of mentoring in their lives, role models, any thoughts specifically when it comes to women and girls and the ways in which we might enhance social capital for them?
Absolutely. There are a lot of organizations here in Charlotte that are doing the work to mentor women and girls on several fronts, on a lot of issues. Girls on the Run, there are plenty of sororities, the Girl Scouts. There are a lot who are doing the work to kind of elevate the voices, to elevate the work. I think a lot of it happens individually in the ways that women are coming together to ensure that young girls have the tools that they need to strengthen their sense of self, to strengthen their own self-worth, self-valuation, self-esteem, all of that, giving them language that they need, homegrown language from their neighborhoods, from their culture, in order to not just survive, but to thrive in this world, to take advantage of opportunities. I think that is happening around the community. But what needs to happen is that once they step out of their own particular conclaves, that additional support needs to come. So what does that mean? That means that we need to invest in education for women and girls. That means that we need to close the pay gap. That means that we need to ensure that all children, regardless of gender, have safe and affordable childcare. It means that we need to ensure that their moms are paid a living wage. There is a lot that we can do to ensure that women and girls have a safe, affordable life so that they can thrive and do well in our society and culture, that women have access to opportunities, because we're saying, that we're a more equitable society and culture, but that then there are some career fields where women are still dealing with discrimination and harassment because they're entering into fields where they're not welcome. How do we begin to change the mindset that women can do anything? Right, that they can excel in any area that they choose? How do we begin to have those conversations? How do we explain that? How do we do that work? So that's part of the reason why the Women and Girls Research Alliance is here, to have and to push those conversations, to push the envelope and to encourage. How do we give women and girls those tools that they need? How do we add to their toolbox and pull it from every corner of the community? Again, wisdom comes from everywhere. It comes from expected and unexpected places. How do we pull all of that in? It also needs to come from the men in our community, right? And how do the men in our community have those conversations with other men who are doing things that would inhibit women and girls from succeeding? Because we need our men to be counterparts in these conversations.
So look, I'm curious because Professor Chetty not only has done a lot of research, obviously, on the issue of upward mobility around rankings of cities and things like that led to a lot of our work, but has also done a good deal of research on exposure and the importance of that at the neighborhood level. And I think some of it indicates that especially girls and women need role models that look like them. They need men in their lives. We need to be allies and all of that, but they also need other women and girls to step in and show them what's possible and career paths and things like that. How do you feel about ensuring that girls have more role models that look like them, that can speak to their issues?
There are plenty of role models here in the city of Charlotte. I know quite a few of them who are just doing great work in the tech industry, in the medical field, in law enforcement. I know these women. One of my mentors, Dr. Ophelia Garman Brown, she is fantastic. She is someone who has a spirit of excellence in everything she does. And she moves very quietly about it. She just does the work, right? She's just a beautiful spirit, right? And she doesn't have to say a lot. You just have to watch her and watch how she moves, right? There are women in tech who are doing the work. Mayor Lyles and the work that she does, she just moves slow and steady. She does the work. Sonia Gant, who's doing work in education. There are women everywhere who are doing this work. All we have to do is look around and make the connections and provide spaces for our girls to find these women. She built this city, right? They're doing work bringing women and girls into the construction fields, and now they're bringing STEM into that. All of that, it is here and it is available. We just have to make the connections. A lot of times the connections aren't made because the students in schools aren't exposed, or maybe those in the education system may or may not be aware, but these role models are available. Elizabeth, fantastic role model. I met her in our first conversation. I knew that she was someone that I needed to know and someone that I needed to connect with. She is fantastic, right? So these women are available in our community. All you have to do is ask. I put together a list of women and girls serving organizations that I am happy to share and connect folks to. So it's just asking the question. And I'm always willing to share and collaborate with folks who have questions.
By the way, Ophelia is on in this session and has has expressed her appreciation, and I think is universally thought of as everyone's dream team.
Yes.
You know, especially on this call and in so many different areas. So I'll express my own gratitude to Ophelia for being on my dream team. Bob, let's take that, and then the time has flown, so I want to give everyone a little bit of an opportunity to talk about their own dream teams. But really quickly, when it comes to that dream team concept, what can people do to expand their teams, to acknowledge their teams, you know, within the framework that you've established? What is it that how people can get involved?
So I think the first thing I would say is I think we've touched on this a little bit, is that this is not an easy conversation to have. And there are a lot of reasons why social capital doesn't spread. It's interesting, obviously, one of the words is capital, right? And similarly, like, we don't feel comfortable giving money away to anyone. Who deserves it? Who do we give it? We think there's finite resources. We have sometimes the same approach to our social capital. And there's also been some really fascinating research done by Rachel Rutan at the University of Toronto that shows that people who have succeeded in life or overcome a struggle are often less likely to be compassionate or helpful to others going through the same struggle. And one of the reasons for that is that the sense that, like, you know, they feel as if maybe they're just holding on to that rung, and to give up something is to sort of put their situation at risk. So one, I would just say that I think we need to sort of just be aware of how challenging it can be sometimes when we're having this conversation around our networks or our social capitals or introductions or things like that, which should not be a barrier to sort of, like, you know, obviously extending our helping hand to others. I think there's the other thing in terms of just being aware of how we show up for others and where we show up. Brian, I think your story about Paul Newman is really interesting. He led with humility. You know, I, interestingly enough, rewrote my biography a while ago to reflect not who I was or what I accomplished, but who helped me. So I think that the more we model that we didn't do it by ourselves, or that there were others that helped us, gives permission for people. You know, Harold mentioned this question of we need to be invited, which I agree with, but I think sometimes, you know, we also need to acknowledge that you need to ask to be invited, and that doesn't come easily for others. You know, I was a kid in high school who walked around the outside of a dance floor too embarrassed to sort of ask someone for a dance. You know what I mean? And so that reality sort of, it's a metaphor for how we may approach where we feel comfortable sort of stepping into certain rooms and getting a seat at the table, or being able to ask for help when's necessary. So, you know, I think that as community leaders, the more that we can model how we got to where we are and share our dream teams, then it gives permission for people to realize, oh, wait, I don't have to do this on my own. And here's not only, what I need to do, but specifically the kinds of help that I need, because it's different, right? That's one thing. And then the final thing I'll just add is that sometimes even when we are in the most well-intentioned way, extending ourselves to help others, we can do it with an inaccurate view of the people we're trying to help. I'm sure we're all familiar with deficiency framing and things like that. And I've seen that in organizations where I've served, where people sort of show up thinking they have all the answers, and they don't really see the person in front of them. And so they don't understand who they are, where they're coming from, or what their needs are. So I think that, paying more attention to sort of where we show up and how we show up can make a world of difference in terms of encouraging ourselves and others to lend our social capital and be on other people's dream teams and add to our own.
So this time has flown by, and I would encourage everyone, let's not end the conversation with this panel today. We started some things before the COVID crisis around this. I want to pick that thread back up. This is an area that I think is to me, it's the most important thing we can do as a community to ensure that the other investments we're making around affordable housing and college access are all much more successful, is to invest in this and find ways to encourage the creation of more social capital. But what I would love to do, Bob, is take your dream team concept and just really quickly go around this group to just maybe give a highlight of one or two people who are on your dream team and what they did for you. So I don't know, I don't want to put you on the spot, but if anyone wants to jump in and just give me a highlight of who on your dream team is the most valuable player and what did they do for you? Well, we got some, Dr. Meggs.
Oh, okay. Someone who was on my dream team. Again, I would offer Dr. Ophelia Garment-Brown how she's her kindness and how she moves quietly to get things done. The other person who I would say would be on my dream team, oh my goodness, is an old mentor of mine who has since passed away. She was a previous vice president at the Urban League. Her name was Celeste. And she always pushed me to put my best foot forward in all things. Mm-hmm.
Thanks. Richard.
I just want to slip in one other point too, off the back of Dr. Meggs' point about people like me and the need for role models, and really make a plug for more male teachers, and especially male teachers of color. Mm-hmm. We're at 76% of K-12 teachers are now female. It's up from 2/3, and there's a particular dearth of Black men in the teaching profession and the caring professions generally. And so I think that cuts both ways. And the evidence suggests that, like, for girls, being taught by a woman in STEM really helps. But exactly the same is true of boys being taught in the humanities by men. And breaking down those kind of gender stereotypes. It can't be good that we now have more women proportionally flying fighter jets than we do men in pre-K classrooms. There's a bit like a threefold difference in the chance of a woman flying a fighter plane and a man being a pre-K teacher, right? That's a very, very bad situation. But I'm going to go all the way back to when I was actually in high school and thinking about college. And because of an extracurricular activity that one of our teachers ran unpaid, we were always arguing in class. And so he ran a debate club. There's nothing like the good ones that are here, but it was great. And I did that and ended up getting quite good at it. And then this woman from the debate club went away to Oxford University. She was the first one from our school to go to such a prestigious college. And then she said to me, she said, come visit me. And I got on the bus and I slept on the floor of one of her friends and I walked around this place. And I suddenly thought, wow, this is amazing. Maybe I should try. And I tried and I got in. And it was a turning point in my life. So that woman, Sarah Sheikh, who I met through an extracurricular activity provided free by a committed teacher, was just one of those moments of transition. If Sarah hadn't been there and Sarah hadn't suggested to me to come, it would never have occurred to me to apply. literally wouldn't have occurred to me to apply. So I was the second person from my school to go to Oxford or Cambridge because Sarah Sheikh told me to get on a bus and come visit her. And it's just those moments, right, that one thing rolls into another. And so I would put her like way, way up there in my dream team.
Thanks. Harold.
Yes, I start with my father, Harold Rice Sr. You know, he showed me that it was important to have a diverse dream team. The late Dr. Francis Robichek was one of his great mentors, and so I got to know Dr. Francis Robichek and all of his kids, and we're really close to this day. So Dr. Francis Robichek and so my father, for that, and also Chris Jackson. You know, I stalked Chris Jackson for a while to say, hey, I love what you do. I love the way you go about your business and your trajectory, and I need to be a part of what you're doing in any way. And so he said yes. And so I'm so grateful that Chris Jackson is one of my mentors. Chris
at Goodwill, right?
Correct.
Yeah. So Bob, quickly, who's your MVP?
Yeah, well, so I would, it starts with my mom. I mean, like a very early age, protecting us from a lot of bad things that could have set me way back. She instilled the possibility that I could go to college by a silly nickname called the Little Professor. There was a teacher when I moved from Boston to Pennsylvania, Jack Downs, who just made that transition smoother, and who knows what would have happened if he didn't. Interestingly enough, I tried to reach out to him years later to thank him, and he had just passed away 2 months earlier, which is a reminder to not only sort of like remember our dream teams, but also acknowledge it and make sure people know the role they've played in helping us get along. And again, there's hundreds of others.
Well, I'll quickly tell you that I started my career as an attorney and complained about my love life and my job every day to a person, and finally said, shut up, Brian, I'm going to introduce you to this woman who became my wife and got me over to working for nonprofits a long time ago. And I keep him in my thoughts every day, what he did for me. So with that, I think I want to thank all of you. You've been terrific. We've barely scratched the surface, but I've truly enjoyed this time together. And we've got a lot to do. So Elizabeth, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you to all of our panelists. That was an amazing and powerful discussion. Thank you, Brian, for your very personal and thoughtful facilitation of that discussion. I would like to note that our social capital grant cycle actually opens at the end of this week. So if you would like more information on that, please email us at civicleadership@fftc.org. I'd also like to thank Sally and Russell Robinson and Foundation for the Carolinas President and CEO Michael Marsicano, as well as Brian. And I really thank all of you for just attending this discussion, for your thoughtful feedback. We do invite you to participate in the next discussion, which is titled Food Security, Innovation and Opportunity, and that will be held on October 12th at 1 p.m. You can register online at our website at fftc.org. And again, we are so thankful that you took the time to join us today, and we invite you to carry this conversation forward, have more discussion, more connections, and get involved. Have an impactful day. Thank you.